Many centuries ago, there was a tiny island nation that was attacked by a powerful dictator in a nearby country. And this dictator had a very mighty army at his disposal. So when he landed on the island, the tiny defense force of the island was quickly overwhelmed, and the dictator was free to begin his march toward the capital city in the center of the island. And with less than a day to decide what action to take, the leaders of the island desperately discussed what could be done in the face of the invasion. Now, the leaders never made a final decision without going to consult a prophet who lived on the island. Now, she was very well respected, and she was known for having great insight into the divine and the workings of the world. And so they came to her and asked her what to do. After a day of meditation and deep prayer, this prophet returns to the leaders with a heavy heart and a sad look on her face. And she said, "I bring sad news. I have been told that God himself has joined with our enemies and has put all his power at their disposal." Well, the elders left in despair. Some called for a quick surrender. Others suggested that the leadership get on the fastest ship that the island had and try to flee and form a government in exile. But the elder, the chief elder, was a strong man with a deep faith. And so he said, "Please trust me, I know exactly what to do." And because he was respected by all, they agreed, albeit reluctantly, to trust him. That day he called all the men of the island who could fight. And then he went through them and he sent everybody home who had young children still at home. And then he also sent home any men who had been married for less than a year. And finally all he had left was this tiny force compared to this dictator's professional army. And these brave men were armed and told to march with their chief toward the invaders. Well, that day the battle was very bloody and several good people lost their lives. But to everyone's utter surprise, the dictator's seemingly invincible army was devastated and it had to turn away in defeat and head home. The entire island was dumbstruck as they heard the news. The prophet, most of all, because she knew the secret that the people had not been told, that God had joined the side of the enemy. And so the prophet approached the chief and asked, "How did you know to fight when the odds were so impossible against you? And that even God himself was using his power against you?" Well, the chief merely smiled and replied, "Surely you know that it doesn't matter whose side God is on. When God is involved, the oppressed always win." One thing we can know for sure: God cares about people who are oppressed. God cares about people who feel beaten down and used by the systems of this world. God cares about the people who have been abused and exploited by this world. Which is where we find ourselves today in this book of Exodus in the Bible. Exodus 2 tells us that the Israelites groaned under their slavery in Egypt. For hundreds of years they had suffered, working to build the great monuments of the empire. In Exodus we find that they have watched as generation and generation have wasted away. They have chafed under the cruel yoke of the Egyptian domination and cruelty. The mothers of Israel have cried out in agony as the Egyptians have even stolen their firstborn children for slaughter. This hateful cruelty has finally reached intolerable levels. And so the Israelites have cried out. And here is the good news, that there is a God who hears them. There is a God who cares, and so God decides to do something about this. Well, this, even in and of itself, that God would care, was absolutely revolutionary, religiously speaking, in the world at that time. It was revolutionary to think that God would care. People were used to thinking about the gods as being specifically uncaring. Gods were supposed to be in some distant reality. That at worst, they liked to be cruel to human beings. We were all little ants to them, crawling along the earth, and they were like children with a magnifying glass in their hand, waiting to position them just right so that the sun would burn us up. And at best, the gods were supposed to be some faraway, untroubled entities. The thinking was that if you even wanted the help of the gods, you had to earn their help. You had to sacrifice. But here in Exodus, we have a God who moves to act simply because God cares. Nothing like this had ever happened. And so the Israelites cry. Their cries are heard by God, and God takes notice. God said, I hear their crying, I hear their moaning, and I'm going to send someone to help them out of Egypt. He grew up, and so he finds this person, Moses. Now, Moses isn't the person that you would expect God to use. And it's not because Moses is unsure of himself. It's not because Moses was not a great speaker. We often want to look to that fact. But the reason you wouldn't expect Moses is quite simple. Moses is a Hebrew, but he previously was adopted into the Pharaoh's household in Egypt. He grew up in luxury because of his people's pain. He grew up as a prince of Egypt, as his countrymen lived an existence completely devoid of dignity. Moses has spent a good portion of his life sitting idly by as others, very much like him, have suffered. This is why I think Moses asks God, who am I that I should do this task? It's not because he's afraid. It's because Moses knows who he is. He is the Hebrew who has Hebrew blood flowing in his veins, and yet he has grown up as an Egyptian in every other way. But God calls on Moses. Well, Moses, who is now living in exile away from Egypt, is watching his father-in-law's sheep. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees up on this mountain a bush that is on fire, and this is kind of a curious thing, so he climbs up the mountain to take a closer look. And sure enough, the bush is burning, and yet the fire isn't burning it up. Well, this is very strange indeed. Something very special is happening, and that's when Moses hears a voice from the bush, calling his name and telling him that he is in a holy place. The voice tells Moses that he is the God of his ancestors. I've been hearing the moans and cries of my people over in Egypt, the voice says. They are suffering under the hand of the Egyptians. And I've decided that the time is right to bring them up out of that terrible place and bring them into a good land. And you know what, Moses? You're going to be the person that I use to do all of this. This voice, which Moses is starting to figure out, is maybe the voice of God. Tells him that he'll be right there with Moses the whole time. God will give him signs and power. And eventually, when the time is right, with God's help, the Israelites will go free. Well, Moses still needs some more information. For example, a name. Who are you, God? Moses asks. What should I tell the people your name is? I can't very well go into the halls of the mighty Pharaoh, the most powerful person in all of the land, and tell him to let the Israelites go without a name. I can't tell the Pharaoh that I'm speaking on behalf of a talking bush. That won't go very well. Everyone will laugh at me. And so God gives him a name. I am who I am. It's a phrase that we actually can't translate very well. It doesn't translate very well from Hebrew into English. But it's something like I am who I am, but it's also I am what I will be, or I am the one who is. We can't quite wrap the language around it, but even if we could, even in the original Hebrew, that's part of the point. The name God gives Moses, it conveys this idea that the language of human beings is simply too limiting for God, as big as this God happens to be. This God who is going to move for God's people is bigger than any name. Is bigger than the limits of human knowledge and human thought and understanding. This God is going to go and is already moving so far beyond the comprehension that to name that God is to cheapen God's essence. It'd be like slapping a name on this God would be like drawing a stick figure and hanging it next to the Mona Lisa and calling it art. The only thing left to say of this God is that this God is. I am will be sending Moses. And so this story is set in motion, one that we all know well, maybe as much because of Charlton Heston and Cecil B. DeMille as because of the Bible, but that's okay. But this great story of God is set in motion. It's maybe the second most important story in all of Scripture, with the one exception of the story of Jesus. Because this story shows that God moves in people and God moves for people because God hears the cries of those who live in slavery. God moves because God cares. No other God is like this. And in fact, this sets a pattern in the Bible and throughout history. Anytime a person or a group of people move to oppress or enslave others, it's because they're acting out of the darkness of sin. The fear and the selfishness that exists in all of our hearts makes us want to bring other people under our control. And when that happens, any people that want to have the audacity to call themselves the people of God must label such behavior as evil and challenge it. Doesn't matter if it's the Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites, or whether it's the Pharisees burdening the people with heavy religious laws. It doesn't matter if it's the slave masters of the antebellum American South, or whether it's the apartheid government of South Africa proclaiming all Africans to be less than fully human. It doesn't matter whether it's corporations selling toasters and T-shirts in one part of the world by exploiting the poorest people in the other parts of the world. When God hears the cry of the oppressed, God demands that his people stand up and demand freedom and dignity for those who live under such oppression. As the old civil rights song reminds us, God is emphatic that if one of us is in chains, then none of us are free. The prince of Egypt becomes the liberator of Israel. This is a pattern that happens a lot. And God has called a lot of Moseses to stand up to a lot of pharaohs through the ages. In the 1970s, violence and repression engulfed the Central American nation of El Salvador. Poor peasants who were trapped in poverty were brutalized by the military government that had one of the worst human rights records in the world. People were forced to live in squalor, and if they tried to demand dignity from the military government, they were kidnapped or murdered or tortured or some combination of all of those things. Well, in 1977, there was a need for a new archbishop for the Catholic Church in that country. And the church had had a long history of looking the other way when it came to the government's abuses. It was essentially in bed with the government. As church leaders searched for an archbishop, the name of Oscar Romero came up. Romero was known to be a quiet and mild-mannered person, the type of person who wouldn't be expected to upset the status quo. And so it seemed like a great choice, and so the church, with the military government's consent, appointed him as archbishop. Everyone thought that he'd be passive, even in the face of great abuses. And for a while he was. However, much like Moses, who was raised as Egyptian nobility, God found someone in Romero whom he could use. It happened after one of Romero's close friends, a priest named Rutilio Grande, was killed by government soldiers as he worked to organize peasant farmers into protest and self-reliance groups. The brutality of Grande's murder had a profound impact on Romero. In fact, he wrote later that, when I looked at Rutilio laying there dead, I thought, if they have killed him for doing what he did, then I too have to walk the same path. And so he began to speak out against the government when they would kidnap or murder poor farmers or peasants or priests. Like Moses, whose story was born out of the slaughter of Israel's firstborn at the hands of Egypt, Romero would meet with mothers whose sons had been disappeared by the junta, and he would demand investigation and democratization. He traveled among the rural poor calling for justice, and he began a spiritual and political revival in that country. Romero received death threats, and yet he carried on. The voice of God speaking through a priest who, like Moses, wasn't known for his strong speaking skills, who was seen as quiet and bookish. But with the power of God, who heard the groans and cries of the people of El Salvador, Romero became a strong voice for those who had no voice. In spite of extensive persecution, Romero became the most widely heard voice on the radio, where his sermons were carried weekly. Everyone would listen, and every week he would list individuals whom the government had seized or taken away, and no one knew where they were, and he would demand justice. And finally, in March of 1980, Romero called upon the soldiers of the army to disobey their orders if their commanders ordered them to brutalize the people. It was interpreted as an act of treason. And the very next day, as Romero celebrated Mass, as he prepared to celebrate Holy Communion, and was holding the chalice up, offering words of blessing, a government assassin came and shot him and killed him. All of his congregation witnessed the murder. However, the spirit of Romero lived on in the people whom he had called to liberation, and years later his brave words and deeds inspired them to a revival inspired enough of a revival to force the military government into surrender, opening the door for democracy and more opportunity for the poor and a life of dignity for everybody. Today, Oscar Romero is honored by millions as a modern-day Moses. He's memorialized in a statue at Westminster Abbey in London, alongside other 20th century martyrs like Martin Luther King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who fought the Nazis and used the gospel against them. But it started out because Romero came to recognize that God loves the oppressed and God's people cannot turn their back on them. For Romero, Jesus Christ wasn't sitting back in some hammock in heaven waiting for us to join him when we die. Jesus Christ is down here with the people, with them in suffering and hardship and with them in resistance to oppression, whatever form that it takes. His kingdom is slowly taking shape here in this world. And that's what we see here in the story of Moses and God encountering one another on the great mountain of the Lord. However, it's also what makes this story something that's a bit hard for us to fully understand in this place, because, let's face it, the truth of the matter is none of us are particularly oppressed. We live lives of relative privilege, and that's not to say that we should be ashamed of ourselves for it, but it is simply to say that when we read the stories of Moses and the liberation of Israel, we largely miss the emotional impact of their slavery and the joy of God's liberation. However, God calls on all persons to be the message of freedom and dignity for those who do live under such circumstances. Moses started out as an Egyptian noble person. Oscar Romero began as the bishop in the government's pocket. But both men, when God opened their eyes, became the champion of those who cried out in pain. We can do the same thing. As we leave this place, my hope and prayer and challenge for you is that you'll spend some time today or this week or in the weeks ahead looking around. Where are God's people crying out? Where are people groaning in their slavery? Whether that slavery takes the form of poverty or addiction or government oppression in some distant land, and ask yourself, what might God be calling you to do? Who are the pharaohs that God might want you to help undermine? If our message isn't even a little bit dangerous to the oppressors of this day, then it isn't the gospel, it's something else entirely. So let us go out together into a world full of pharaohs, and a world full of the cries of the needy, and very thankfully, a world full of burning bushes that aren't being consumed. And let us listen to the voice of God as God speaks to us and calls us to bring dignity to others. In the name of the Father, the Son,